So picking up from where we left off, we're going to make these buttons actually work now. We wrote our stop command and that was it. And now we're going to put code on all three of these buttons. So the end game is we want to click the button and we want to tell the timeline to go play that specific spot, right? So you're sitting here starting on frame 1. If I click flip, it should just play this. If I click shrink, it should display this. Easy enough, right? But this is where we get really powerful with our timelines and are suddenly non-linear. Instead of just playing an animation from start to finish, now we can stop the timeline in different places wherever we want, and we'll also be able to use buttons to tell the playhead to jump around. And there's just so much power in there with being able to create so many things, pages changing, interactive animation. There's so much we can do with just this one set of button code. So let's go ahead, and the first step when making a button work. So if you remember when we made graphics and created these and we went to convert to symbol, making sure it's an actual button rather than a graphic symbol. And then when you go inside the button, now you've got your up, over, down, and hit states, all that stuff just for your graphic stuff there. Let's see. Oh yeah, so one of the most overlooked aspects of writing code and making buttons work inside of this is we have to actually give the button what's referred to as an instance name or a stage name so we can actually talk to it in the code. What I want you to do is select the move button on the stage, and you can see over here in the properties panel, right near the top, there's this input field that says instance name. All right, and this name is necessary for us to be able to talk to this specific thing, this specific object in our code. So what I want to do is, so the instance is, all right, so it's named button1. I'm going to name it the same thing that's named in the library. When you're naming instance names that you're going to talk to in code, be sure to use all lowercase and don't use any spaces. All right, so we're going to name this button1. Like this. Now, it can be very tempting to do this, uppercase B, space 1. It won't even let you actually put a space in. But programmers, there's certain rules to the way things work, and programmers always try and keep things lowercase where they can. I'll show you where that all changes with our button code. But you just need to give this an instance name. Now, the reason, even though it's the same name as the object name in the library, the reason we need to give it an instance name is we could, in theory, have like 4 copies of the same button from the library. Like if it didn't say move, if they just didn't have a label, for example, we could have 4 different objects of the same from the library, and if we're talking to them in code, it needs to know which instance of that we're talking about. So each of these 4, this could be like button 1A, button 1B, button 1C, button 1D, but each one would have to have a different name, a different identifier to talk to in the code. So because of that, because we can have multiple copies of the same library item, we typically don't just use the library item as the name. In fact, with buttons, it won't even really work that way. You still have to give it an instance name before we do anything. So let's go ahead and give all 3 of these buttons an instance name. So we've got button 1. I'm going to select the flip button, go to the instance name, make that one button 2. Click on the shrink button, go to an instance name, make that button 3. Okay, and then you could click them. Be sure not to double click and go inside of them by accident, but if you just select them on the stage, you should see in the properties panel button 1, button 2, and button 3. All right, so now I've got those instance names. I'm just going to save my file real quick. Command S, file save. And now let's actually write the code. So the first question would be, where do we put the code, right? We always put code on keyframes, and we want to keep all of our code on this code layer that's at the very top. And in this case, we actually want to put our code on the same frame as our stop command, because this is as far as it goes right now. It's just stopped. And we have to let the user, like the frame has to play so that we can actually get to the button code to set up the buttons. If I were to put the button code over here somewhere, the timeline would never get to it and it would not know what to do, right? So we have to kind of initiate the button code in the same place where we're making the user wait to be able to hit the button. So when they click the button, the code knows what to do. So let's get right to it. Let's open up your actions panel, open up that code layer. All right, so the first step is that we need to actually call out the name of the button that we just labeled. So we say this dot and then the name of the button. So mine was button 1, and it'll try and add these little boxes to give you things to like try and autofill. Just ignore that and click away from it. So this dot button 1. So we're calling this, we're going to do something to the specific button. And then we say dot on. And then just do an open, closed, parenthesis, and a semicolon, just like we did with a this dot stop, right? So start with this dot button 1 dot on. Okay, so I'm going to go up and put a space above here. Now, comment is very common in code. What it is, it's a way for you to write notes to yourself or to other programmers telling you what the code is doing. But if you write it as a comment, it won't actually show up, or it won't be read by the compiler. All right, so you do a comment in JavaScript, and this is what we're writing again. We're writing in JavaScript by putting 2 forward slashes. And then once you put 2 forward slashes, then anything you put in front of that, this will stop the timeline from playing. It kind of turns this gray color and nothing will be affected. Now, if I didn't have those 2 forward slashes and I just typed stuff, then it's going to think this is code and it's going to freak out and nothing's going to work. But if I put 2 slashes in front of it, then you can put whatever you want right there, right? So spaces don't really matter. I often will put comments and spaces around things just to make them look clean as you build and get more and more and more. Let's see. For example, if I showed you a crazy application I'm in the middle of working on, I guess there's not a ton of comments, but I guess there's a few telling you what things are, and there's just lots of spacing and rules and stuff like that. All right, so anyway, this will stop the timeline from playing. This dot stop, sweet. This will stop the current timeline from playing. And then it's a good idea just to start with a comment. Whenever you're writing code, just kind of tell yourself what you're trying to do. So in this case, let's see, sets up the move button. All right, that's what we're doing here, is we're setting up the move button with this button 1. And all right, so anyway, just put a space there just for legibility, but now you can see how you can create these comments, right? So we start with this dot button 1 dot on. And I start it like this because it's kind of similar to the stop thing, where this is a reference to the current timeline that we're on. Later on, we'll get a little more complicated, and we'll be referencing other timelines from different spots. But for right now, we're just going to stick with the current one we're on. So this dot stop will stop it. And now this dot button 1 is telling me, okay, there is a button on this timeline that is in this position named button 1. And it's saying, okay, this dot button 1, and then on is like a call to something interactive. So the next step is we start to put some parameters inside these parentheses, all right? So this dot button dot on what? We will say inside of quotes, I want to put the word click, like that, inside of the parentheses. So this dot button 1 dot on click. And that's telling it, okay, when the user clicks this button, we want it to do something, okay? And a click means when you press down and then let go, I've talked about that, I think the last time, about how that's how most buttons fire, is sometimes on a desktop or a laptop you can see a rollover state. There's no such thing as a rollover on a touch screen, so you at least touch the screen to push the button, and usually you'll see some kind of feedback, some kind of visual feedback that you're touching the button. It should change states in the down state. And then when you let go of it, or you let go of your mouse button or whatever it is you're using to interact with the screen, when you let go, that's usually when the event fires to whatever you're telling the button to do. All right, so far, we've just set up telling it, okay, when we click on button 1 is the way we're saying this. So this, that button 1 on click. And then after the second quote, before the parenthesis, we need to put a comma and a space. There's another parameter here. And now we need to put the word in all lowercase function, and it should turn purple. A function inside of JavaScript is basically a collection of commands that you can run at a particular time. You can call it individually, or you can have a button kind of call a function. So we're building our function right into our button here. And after the word function, put a space, and then another set of open close parentheses, and then another space. And then we're going to want an open curly bracket, which on my keyboard, on a Mac keyboard, is just to the right of the P. It's the shift of the regular bracket. You get this little open curly bracket, a little nose pointing to the left. I'm going to hit return. And that automatically, when I hit return after that curly bracket, automatically put a space, indented my cursor, and then closed the curly bracket, followed by closing the parenthesis and the semicolon. And this is what you need to end up with. Yeah. So what this is doing is saying, okay, when we click on button 1, we want to do something, right? Well, this whole function thing is basically setting up a place where we can tell it to do something. All right, so we can do something, and then if we wanted, we could do something else. And if we wanted, we could even do more stuff. So there's no limit to what we can tell the program to do when we click on a button. Just understanding that this is the setup for the button. That, again, it's really, really important that we have that instance name on the stage, or this will do nothing. Or actually, it'll give you an error. But once we say button on click, and then we set up this function in this whole funky way here, this comma, word function, open close parenthesis, open curly bracket, and then anything inside of these two curly brackets, the rest of this kind of closes the whole thing, closes the whole line. And anything inside of these two curly brackets, inside of the function, we could put as many commands as we wanted, and it will do all of them as soon as we push the button, okay? And the first thing we want to do, though, is we want to play the move animation. So I'm going to put a little comment in there to tell me that's what I'm going to do. Again, these comments, all of this stuff will work without the comments at all. I just like to put them in certain places to kind of let me know what's going on. So you can set up the comments to your own liking, make your own notes in there, whatnot, or you can just leave them out if you want to leave it nice and clean. That's entirely up to you. But now, let's see. So I'm going to put another comment here, and sets up a variable for the current timeline. All right, now one thing that is one of the first things that you learn when you use JavaScript is that the word this annoyingly changes what it's referencing, okay? So by default, this means the current timeline. And we can use it here at this base level and say this dot stop, and it'll stop the current timeline. Say this dot button one, and we'll find the button one on the current timeline. But then as soon as we go inside of a function, then the word this changes meaning. So if I were to try and play the timeline from here and say, for example, this dot play, which you can do just like this dot stop just to start playing it, that won't work because all of a sudden, once we're inside of the timeline, or inside of the function, then the word this suddenly refers to the button. Okay, so now all of a sudden it's trying to play a button rather than the timeline, which isn't going to do what we wanted. So it's important to remember that the word this kind of jumps around a little bit. And because of that, sometimes we'll set up a variable to reference it. And then we can use that variable to reference what we're actually talking about. So we're going to create a variable, which is just like a placeholder of information that we can then reference later. It's like using the memory key on a calculator. I'm going to start that with a var space, so create a new variable. And then we can name this variable anything we want. I'm going to name it timeline because that's what we're talking about here. And we'll say variable timeline equals this. Okay. Now we have this reference to it. Let's see. And now that we have a reference to it, now we can reference it down here. And we could say timeline dot play, and that would actually work, okay? But we don't want to just play the timeline because we're sitting here on frame 0, and if we just play it, in fact, let me see how that works right now. That should just start playing. We should see about 1/3 of a second when nothing happens, and then it should just play the move animation, play the flip, play the shrink, and then it should loop, because all timelines automatically loop. It should loop back to the beginning and then get stuck on frame 1 again. Let's try, let me try running this in the browser. And it's sitting here doing nothing as we would expect. It's just sitting here. And in theory, when I click this move button, aha, it did it. It played the timeline. So go ahead and try that. See if you can get yours to work. Save my file. Starting to think it would make more sense for me to set the variable first and then use timeline in both of these spots also, but it doesn't really matter. I think it's good for you to get introduced to the mind warp that is the word this inside of JavaScript. If you start coding it all, it'll come up a lot. I think it makes a little more sense that I'm going to switch this up. I'm going to set the variable first. So we really only have to use the word this once. We'll say var timeline, that's what we're talking about, is our timeline down here, equals this. And then I should be able to say timeline.stop to keep it stopped. And I can even use it here and say timeline.button1. And then timeline.play. We're using that in all of these different places. And now check mine, but it should be doing the exact same thing. So it's still stopped and waiting. I click the move button and it works. All right. Okay, so make those little edits. Just move that, that variable to the top. And then instead of this dot stop, use timeline dot stop. So what we should be doing, instead of just playing, because we're going to want these buttons, like the flip button isn't just going to play all of them. We want it to jump to the specific one, right? So for right now, instead of play, we're going to type just like this, go to and play. Okay, now this is what's called camel case in programming. I don't know why they don't have the T in uppercase. They kind of consider go to together for some reason. But this is really common in JavaScript and programming in general, is to start lowercase, and every time you change a word, that you uppercase to start the new word. And that's just called camel case, and that's the way a lot of things in programming are done. So this command telling the timeline to go to and play means don't just play from where you're at now, but you can actually tell it where you want it to go jump to and start playing. So that's where we can put in our frame label. Now you can technically put in a frame number here, like I could put number 10, and that would jump here and start doing it. But you always want to use, instead of frame numbers, you always want to use frame labels. And frame labels you have to put inside of quotes. And I'm going to type in move, all lowercase, just in the same way that I have it labeled right here. And now what it should do is, instead of taking like a third of a second, it should jump instantly to start playing. And for now, it's going to continue playing through the other ones. But using go to and play like this, moving along with a with a frame label can jump you to a specific spot. So let me try that out. Open it up, click move, jumps right away. Now it continues playing them because there's nothing stopping it. But I can test that by maybe instead of move, I can tell it to go to and play flip instead. Now I can test it. And now I'm not putting this on the flip button yet. This isn't doing anything. I'm just testing the frame label thing. I click on move. Now it goes straight to flip. All right, so I'm going to set this back to move for now. As soon as this is working for this one button, you can go ahead and copy this code 2 more times, and we can set it up to work for the other 2 buttons. All right, so I'm just going to copy this whole thing. I'm just putting a space in between them just so it's a little more legible here. But then for each of these, I'm just going to change what needs to be changed. So I'm going to go to this second set here, and instead of setting up the move button, I'm going to set up the flip button. And I'm going to say on the timeline, this one's named button 2. And it's on click, it's on function, but this time I want to play the flip animation. And I can make it go to and play my frame label flip. I'll do the same thing in the last one for the shrink. Now again, half of the changes I'm making, I'm just changing the actual comments that I put in here. The comments can make it look a little more confusing. Like maybe, well, I'll leave them in there for now. It's fine. It's good practice. But timeline.button3 is the name of our button there. And play the shrink animation. Then we'll tell it to go to and play shrink. All right, I'm going to try this in my browser. And now I'm sitting here, and now I can click move. It moves, keeps going through the other ones as well, but it starts on move. Just keeps going to and playing that move command. And now the flip button just keeps going to and playing the flip command right away. It'll still play through the rest of the timeline and then reset, but I can flip, I can move, I can shrink right away. So hit the move button, just continues along. So what we have to do is we have to tell the timeline to stop at the end of each of these spots, right? And then we can get it to move and then tell it to stop there. So what I'm going to try, I'm going to put a keyframe here at the end of my move animation. I'm going to put a stop command here. Now, I'm curious, I'm not sure if I can use timeline here. And this is something that I'm just going to tinker with for a second. I think we might have to put, oops. I think we might just have to use this again, because I don't think that, I'm going to delete this for now, but I don't think that the variable, when you define it with VAR here, I believe that that is only referenceable through the current frame. I don't think it's going to know what timeline means over here. I'm going to try it just out of curiosity. See if that actually stops it. We might just freak out and give it an error. Open my inspector, look at it for a second, hit move, and it gave it a big crazy error. So yeah, it did not understand what that is. It says timeline is not defined. Tells me exactly what my error is, and it doesn't stop either. It just keeps going. So that's kind of throwing a monkey wrench in it at the very beginning of this whole thing, the variables. But it is really important to understand how these things work. So what, the fact that we're saying timeline dot stop here just to use the same variable over and over again, that's fine because we're using it in so many different spots on this code. But most of the time, when you need to stop the timeline, you're just going to use this. In fact, it's probably going to be a little less confusing if we were to just do that here also. Hopefully you can at least see the difference that, making variables and references to things is quite a big part of programming. So this does the same thing, but now we're just setting up our variable for our timeline down here. And, we could even use this here and here and here. I'm going to change that back. I think we'll be more likely to use the word this in these situations moving forward, telling the timeline to stop, telling which buttons to use. The reason we need this variable again is because once we go inside of a function, the word this, if I were to try and say this.goTo and play, that won't work because suddenly inside the function, the word this is referencing, the actual button itself rather than the timeline. So again, the word this kind of jumps around what it references. It's kind of like a dynamic variable. But I think because of the stop thing, just kind of setting it back to use this to determine what all of our buttons are in the current timeline. But we just have to use a reference to it when we want to reference it inside of these functions. So a little bit confusing, but whatever. Like I said, we're able to basically use these same, if I took out comments, this is really just 3 lines of code, just setting up the button, telling it what we want it to do inside of the thing, and then closing it. As long as we've got our reference to the timeline, we can kind of reuse this button code over and over and over again in different ways. I'm going to end up doing. So, all right, so once I kind of changed that back, now when I go over here and set up a stop command at the end of my animation. So again, you put code on actual keyframes. It's very important to remember and realize where the code should be. So when we first started, we used the keyframe on our frame 1. And the reason was we're stopping the timeline from going anywhere, so it just doesn't play into the animations until they press a button. And then we're setting up all of the buttons so that when we press a button, it knows what to do. If I were to put that button code anywhere else, the button wouldn't know what to do because the frame actually has to it has to play and get to the actual frame for the code to be registered, if that makes sense. So everything on frame 1 should be whatever we need to kind of push these buttons and move off of frame 1. So now that we've jumped from frame 1 and we go along, and now we've got this.stop command, this current timeline, as long as we're not inside of a function. Dot stop, open close parentheses, semicolon. This is the exact same command we used to stop the last time. All right, now though, we're just putting it in a different place. So I put a keyframe at the end of my move animation and put a stop on it. Again, you can see the little lowercase a down there, letting you know there's code on that. And now if I run it, now I can move and it actually stops there. And unless I push one of the other buttons, there's nowhere to get anywhere else besides just keep hitting move. And every time I hit move, it's telling it to go to and play this move label, and then it just plays as long as it can until it hits a stop. So the last step here is to put a stop command at each of the end of the other 2, but I can copy this keyframe in the same way that we copied these animations. So instead of having to create a new keyframe, open the actions panel and type this.stop, open close parentheses, semicolon 2 more times, we can much more quickly realize that, okay, this keyframe, all this keyframe has on it is this stop command. So I can copy this in the exact same way. I can duplicate it and just move it to these other 2 spots. So if I select my stop command here and I hold the Alt key or the Option key, after I select it, now I click again, and now I can drag a copy of it. And see it copied the entire keyframe, including the code that was on it that says stop. I can do the same thing here. I can select that little stop command keyframe, hold Alt, drag it over here, and now I'm going to save my file, and now I have an interactive application. Instead of just running this and seeing an animation, 3 animations play through and continuously loop, now all of a sudden it is interactive, and now the user gets the choice to move, or flip, or shrink. And that timeline is being controlled by our button code and by our stops. And this is, there's a lot going on here, but we'll be able to reuse this in a lot of different ways to be able to make our interactive applications.